All right, and welcome back. So one of the big movements of the 1960s and 1970s, at least in contemporary art, was this movement to the exploration of identity. It was a very tumultuous age. We have the civil rights movement. We have the rise of feminism. We have people becoming openly gay for the first time. We have the Stonewall riots. We'll talk about many of these things, but we want to concentrate today on probably the most important of all these movements as it impacted contemporary art the most, I think, and that is feminist art. And here's where we get to a very rare trigger warning. Feminist art is going to challenge notions of gender, it's going to challenge notions of identity and sexuality, and so because these feminists were fighting uphill, they resorted to things that many people would consider to be obscene, pornographic, overtly sexualized, and overly eroticized. And so I just need to give you fair warning. You're going to see a lot of nudity. You're going to see a lot of sexual content in this lecture. So if you're not interested in that kind of thing, please don't make a strike against me on YouTube. Move on. This isn't for kids. There's no way to avoid it. My mom could be watching this, so just imagine me in the permanent blush state as I have to discuss these things in front of my mother. But it is what it is, and it has to be discussed openly. And so if you're not comfortable with sexuality, nudity, obscene, or heavily eroticized content, then you should probably look away. So let's get into this. Please don't ask me to strike me on YouTube. Jeez. Anyhow, so let's talk a little bit about the history of feminism. Before we can talk about feminist art and where it takes off, we have to talk a little bit about the history of feminism. This is an extraordinarily condensed version of feminism. It's important to note that feminism has roots going back thousands of years. There have always been prominent women in society, and there have always been female artists. That's something that we don't often think of. That, we know from a few accounts that there were some very famous female Greek artists, for example, and that women have always had this ability to accomplish great heights, but simply because of the reality that for most of history, society was patriarchal, women did not get the opportunities to excel in the arts or sciences or anything else, for that matter, until about halfway through the 20th century. Certainly we have individuals like Lavinia Fontana and, of course, Artemisia Gentileschi, but when you examine those, almost in all of those cases, they had a connection to a prominent male artist who believed in them and allowed them to, prosper. So while there's been some very great female artists in the past, they have really not been the major players for reasons, again, of prejudice and sexism. Judith Leister, for example, from the 17th century, was very famous. We can talk about Mary Cassatt or Mozart and many, many, many others. So when we talk about feminism in the contemporary period, the thing that makes it different from all those artists of the previous period is that it's really, really couched in the political movement of feminism. While certainly Rosa Bonheur was a person who, expanded opportunities for women and showed that women could, compete at the highest levels of the Academy and the French Academy in the 19th century, her artwork is not especially political. Her artwork is better couched within the context of, say, Romanticism than within a specific political movement. So how does the feminist art movement of, say, the 1960s and the 1970s get to be so expressly political? Well, it gets that way through a series of events. Basically, for the first 200 years of the modern feminist movement, feminism was concerned about political rights. It's important to remember that women, until the 20th century, in most countries, in most cities, in most states, did not have the right to vote. In many cases, they did not have the right to have property. They didn't have the right to determine their own future. And so there was a push against this. It begins with people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who ends up being the mom of, is it Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein? I think that's right. And she wrote a book, and a lot of her writings were actually hidden until after her death. She was a philosopher and a novelist and wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And it was one of the first times that somebody actually challenged the political establishment. Feminism as a term wasn't really a popular term for most of the 19th or 20th century. It was first used in a newspaper in 1837, but for most of this time, people just called it the women's movement. We kind of retroactively call this period the first wave of feminism. And it really starts to get going when we have the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where we have the feminist heroes Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton come together. They make the Declaration of Sentiments, and eventually they are the ones that push the suffragettes movement, and they're the ones that will, see the passing of the 19th Amendment. Well, they didn't quite see it. They were the ones who would eventually push forward to cause the 19th Amendment to be passed in 1920. And so what's interesting, I think the important thing to point out by feminism as a political movement was never a monolithic movement. There were always many different iterations of feminism. What's interesting is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a mother of several children and was very much dedicated to her children and to nurturing them and to being a mother, whereas Susan B. Anthony didn't have children. Mary Wollstonecraft actually believed in kind of free love and didn't believe in traditional kind of values, whereas Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton pretty much did believe in traditional marriage as an institution. And so what you see is that there's a lot of arguments about what feminism is and what feminism is supposed to be. They were all in agreement that women should have the right to choose their own destiny, but the motivations for how you express that destiny were very different. For example, some feminists believed that the problem with society is that it was far too masculine, and that we needed to express feminine virtues, and that the feminine virtues of things like mothering, nurturing, children, those domestic virtues, that if the world would be a better place if those were given equal voice in society, and if women were given equal voice into society. But others were completely against that. Others were like, there are no feminine virtues. That's just sexism, to suggest that some virtues are masculine and some virtues are feminine. And so rather than embrace feminine virtues and use those to challenge the patriarchy, we need to reject the notion of feminine virtues altogether. And we need to express those values that, the patriarchy is expressing and take them over and take them for ourselves. So it's never been a monolithic movement, but we really owe them a great debt for the improvement of society in many, many ways. And you have to hand it to the suffragettes. I mean, they literally would chain themselves to the White House gates. Woodrow Wilson was a notorious misogynist who hated the suffragettes because he really just hated women, to be perfectly honest. And many of these women went on hunger strikes while they were in prison, and they were force-fed in the brutal circumstances. So, and they really needed to be recognized for the great accomplishments that they brought forth. Plus, also their ingenuity. The first ever advertising by airship, by blimp, was for suffragettes. So I have a kind of soft spot in my heart for zeppelins and blimps and airships of all variety. And so just the notion that the first ever advertisement by blimp was for suffragettes. And so they were very, very clever. They were very, very clever. They worked very hard to, for their rights. And they realized they were working in a system, so they had to work in different and new ways. And I love that. Well, in 1920, women got the right to vote in the United States. And we can see a dramatic change in fashion, Dresses went all the way to, the ankles before this, with layers of petticoats. Haircuts were long and hair was worn up. Women began to enter into professional life to a much greater degree. And so we can see the rapid liberalization of women throughout the 20s and 30s. That's not to say that they didn't face a great deal of sexism. They certainly did. Things change even more when we get to World War II. World War II caused a labor shortage in the United States because so many men were sent to fight in the war. And so quite a few women were actually enlisted to do work at home. And while the vast, we kind of extol the image of Rosie the Riveter, the vast majority of them weren't in factories. There was a fair share of them in factories, but the vast majority of women took over all kinds of jobs, from office jobs to clerical work, and to teaching. This is something that's quite amazing. So my grandmother, Delilah Gwynn Clark, she was a school teacher, but she was teaching school at a time where school teachers were supposed to be unmarried, because that was somehow more appropriate than a married school teacher. I don't know why, but it was. And so in her first contracts that she signed as a teacher, the contract said that she was not to date, she would not go to parties, she would not do any of those things. And in fact, it actually stipulated that if she got married, she would have to end teaching. She would have to cease teaching. Well, then World War II came along, and my grandmother, who was always a firecracker, was fond of saying in church meetings that Adolf Hitler was the best thing that ever happened to women, because that allowed her to go back into teaching. Yeah, she was a character. So she went back into teaching, but only because World War II there was this shortage. So it wasn't just factories, it was all levels of life, and women got economic power. Now, women's economic power before had always been based on cottage industries and, things made at home, and then all of that was kind of taken away by the Industrial Revolution. And so women in the early 20th century were cut off from a lot of economic power. They used to sell, homemade goods all the time. There was a lot of economic life in cottage industry all across America. But they lost that access, and so they reclaimed it by entering the workforce in equal numbers. But of course, as they re-entered the workforce, it was not exactly an equal environment. And this coincided with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, which was trying to address the wrongs of Jim Crow and segregation and all of the discrimination that had faced the African American community and other minorities. And so it made sense that women would jump into this too. In fact, they'd kind of always been together. Frederick Douglass, the very famous civil rights leader of the 19th century, was a close friend of Susan B. Anthony, and they always linked these ideas of emancipation and lack of discrimination with the enfranchisement of women and with the liberalization of women. And so it made sense. And just to point out, again, the kind of cultural environment we were talking about in the 1960s, why women could vote, have businesses, own properties, they were often confronted with less obvious forms of discrimination and prejudice in the workforce, sexism, harassment, all kinds of things. Getting back to my own ancestry, this time to my mother, in the early 1960s, my mother was a middle school teacher. Now, by this time, women could be school teachers and be married. It seems ridiculous that it was just my grandmother's generation that school teachers couldn't be married. It's kind of absurd to think about it. It seems like another universe. But my mother was teaching middle school, and she became pregnant with her first child, my older brother Bobby. And my brother Bobby was born in August, but they told her that she would not be allowed to teach. She would only be allowed to teach as long as she didn't show. My mother was very thin at the time, so she was kind of worried about that. And in May, she started to show. It was obvious that she was showing, and she only had a couple more months of the school year to close out, that she wanted to finish with her, sixth graders, and they refused. They fired her. It's just absolutely unconscionable. You can't even believe this. So in the early 1960s, my mom was fired 2 months early from the end of the school year because she, for heaven forbid, should show people a pregnant woman, which was absurd, and it was absurd even then. My mother fought against it because they all had mothers, their mothers had kids, they knew what pregnant those kids, they're sixth graders, for crying out loud. We often think about the 50s and 60s being more sheltered than they really were, but that was what happened to my mother. And so women were not equals in the eyes of the law, and were not protected in that right. So you can see why they continued the fight. But it also took on another interesting dimension, a very different dimension. And this is where we get into second wave feminism. So first wave feminism is usually defined as that period of feminism from the 18th century up until about the middle of the 20th century, where the goal was political equality, giving women the right to vote, the right to own property, all the same rights as men, at least legal rights. But beginning in the 1960s, it became clear that the fight would have to be extended not just into legal realms, but also into cultural realms. And for this, this is what we call second wave feminism. So the first wave was from the early suffragettes up until about mid-20th century. And then for about the mid-20th century up into about the 1980s, we have second wave feminism. And second wave feminism was really sparked off by this individual, Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan was a professional woman, had a very active and dynamic life, and then she got married. And then her marriage ended up being very unsatisfying. Her husband was abusive or neglectful. Her husband expected her to adopt, even though she was a professional woman before this, expected her to adopt all the conventions of traditional wives, to be, seen and not heard, to be a dutiful hostess and wife and mother. And she just felt that was suffocating. And so she began to see that there were, of course, this eventually led to her divorce, but she began to see that there were a great deal of women in the world who were living lives of quiet desperation, who were constrained, perhaps not by legal means, but were constrained by cultural means that were keeping them out of various avenues of life that they wished to pursue. Of course, there was a lot of women who didn't feel that way, who felt very fulfilled in this traditional life, but there were certainly plenty who did, and who gravitated to her and to her work and to her book. And so in 1966, she became one of the co-founders of a National Organization of Women, and this is generally the publication of her book, and this organization is generally regarded as the beginning of second wave feminism. And so second wave feminism is different from first wave feminism, and second wave feminism very much appropriated the dialectic of critical theory and of Marxism. Marxism sees things in terms of the oppressed and the oppressors. Generally that's defined as class, but the feminists redefined it in terms of gender, that you had a patriarchy that was oppressive and was oppressing individuals who were female. And the goal of second wave feminism was not so much political revolution as it was social revolution, to fundamentally change things. And again, it was as equally divided as the earlier phases of feminism. Some said the goal of this was to bring feminine virtues and identities into the public sphere, to reject masculine virtues. Others were like, no, we need to reject the idea that there's masculine and feminine altogether, that we need to destroy these distinctions, because these distinctions are what keep us in place. And so they couch the women's movement as a part of the civil rights movement. Many of the prominent writers, Kate Millett, Sexual Politics, and Germaine Greer. Germaine Greer is especially important, I think, for feminist art, because her work, The Female Eunuch, talked about how women were subjugating their sexual desires to male sexual desires. They were becoming objectified. They were there just to satisfy male desires. And yet, female libido is obviously real, and women needed to explore their own sexuality. So a lot of the themes of feminist art are going to be very cultural and are going to be about expressing or reclaiming sexual identity, which is why they deal in sexual topics and why they deal in the exposing of nude bodies, female and male genitalia, and even provoking, feelings of disgust and revulsion, to kind of provoke intentionally, to make us think about our sexuality. So all of this is coming to a head, and generally the first attempt at a kind of coherent feminist art came out of the CalArts Feminist Arts program. And the two individuals most responsible for this were Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. And this led to their project Womanhouse in Los Angeles, California. Oh, I forgot to mention, one of the things that we ought to talk about is, should we have feminist art? Now, that's something that seems obvious to us today, but at the time it was a real debate. And in fact, Linda Benglis and several other artists were kind of on the other side of this. The argument, again, this goes back to the inherent divisions of what are the foundational principles of feminism. Are we here to overturn masculine virtues and replace them with feminine ideals? Or is the very existence of feminine ideals itself a kind of oppression or, false consciousness that we need to fight against? In the same way, feminists said, well, if you set up a movement that's called feminist art and create, galleries or venues expressly for women, that seems to suggest that they cannot compete on the same level as men. And so, there were a great many feminist artists that we call feminist artists that rejected the term, because they felt that that was pigeonholing them, that was stereotypical, and it just pushed them off into a category, and that they were fully formed artists that could compete out there in the marketplace of ideas against men just as well as anybody else. And so the last thing you wanted to do was to shove women into a kind of feminist ghetto where they could compete. The counter argument to that is that, well, while women said, yeah, of course we can compete on the same level as men, but we're never given the chance. That without a venue reserved just for us, we will never have the chance to have a voice. That the patriarchy, by various means, discrimination or just outright prejudice or banning us, will never allow us into the blue chip galleries, the big galleries, or the big exhibitions, and so therefore we may never get a chance. This is, of course, the artistic iteration of the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling being that women were coming up in business, they were being, advanced to certain levels of the administration because of their competence and because of their, success in business, but then they would run into a glass ceiling. That is, there was nothing that formally kept them away from becoming, vice presidents and CEOs of businesses, but there was a kind of a boys' club. There was nothing written down, nothing in the bylaws that prevented them from doing it, but it was that they were shut out of access of, places to network. They were shut out from mentors, and if the executives are having a business meeting in a strip club, and I hate to admit that I actually have heard of this happening, that makes it a hostile environment for a woman to go to. She can't, go to that unless she wishes to be very edgy and go into that, and that's a problem. So, by various means, sometimes not even intentional, sometimes subconscious, women were excluded. And so there was this argument that the same thing was true in art circles. Yes, women could compete on the same level as men, but they were being excluded from galleries because gallery owners hire the people they know, and they hire the people they network with. And it's a good old boys club as much as any good old boys club anywhere else. And so therefore, women didn't have access to it. In theory, there was nothing preventing them from competing, but in reality, they never were allowed to compete on a fair and even level playing field. So I think ultimately the second argument is the argument that wins out. While many feminist artists rejected the term feminist, many embraced it and said, we have to break through. We have to break through, and once we break through, then we will have a voice. And once we have a voice, then we can enter out into that greater field. And I just want to say, this is still an issue even today. There is still this discussion of, if we segregate feminist artists or female artists off into a separate category, are we doing them more harm than good? And I think most people have come to realize that, yes, they needed their own separate category, their own spaces to grow and to build their voice, but that assumes that at some point they will have a kind of equal and level playing field, and therefore we can kind of dismantle that feminist art will break through, and then there just won't be a feminist art because women art will be accepted across the board. And then the question is, well, have we reached that moment? There are many, very many, many prominent female artists today that are very successful and doing very well in the gallery structure. But it's still not quite equal representation. And so we still have this debate. Do we still need to have a feminist art today, or do we not? I know where I come down on this, but you may differ. I think that we are miles and leagues away from where we once were. We're so much better off than we once were. There has been genuine improvement in this field. There's been much greater recognition of female artists, much greater recognition of female artists both in the past. When I started in art history, we would be lucky if we'd get one or two female artists before we hit the 20th century. And I try very hard in my lectures to include as many female artists as I can in the curriculum. So there's been a huge expansion of discussion of female artists in the curriculum. There's been a huge expansion of representation of female artists in galleries and museums, but we're still not at parity, and so the debate goes on about how best to break these glass ceilings that continue to exist. So All support to those who are, continuing in that endeavor. All right, let's get back to Womanhouse. So Womanhouse was probably the first real breakthrough. While several artists like Yoko Ono, Yoko Soma, and others could be considered as feminist artists, we generally consider them as proto-feminist artists because they were part of earlier movements, Fluxus, etc., that were touching on these issues, but they were only touching on them tangentially or in a related way. Womanhouse is one of the first that actually just goes straight at it. So Womanhouse was a massive installation, and it was done by a whole cadre of artists, not just Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, and it was done as a collaborative work, and that was part of the intent. The idea was, again, this idea of feminine versus masculine virtues, the idea that competitiveness is a masculine virtue. Now, whether that is or not is an opinion, but there was this perceived notion that competitiveness, that singular competitiveness, mano a mano, was a masculine virtue, and that collaboration and cooperation was a feminine virtue. And so they worked to a model that encouraged collaboration and cooperation. So this wasn't built by any one artist, it was built by several artists working together to create it, with Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro acting more as kind of supervisors over the project, kind of giving shape and scope to the project, but not necessarily being the artist in each case. And so it reimagines an entire house in the space of every house. And it's really such a wonderful work in many ways, because it acknowledges that architecture is gendered, that spaces are gendered, and we don't even think about that. And so they tackle the gender of these spaces. And I'm only going to show you a few of these, but for example, the kitchen. The kitchen is one of the most gendered spaces in the entire house, because women across the world, most societies, have responsibility for domestic duties, for the cooking and preparation of food. And so you can see this both ways. You can see this as a source of, kind of servitude, that you are subjected to serve others, but it's also a source of nurturing, in the sense that the woman gets to decide the budget, she gets to decide the meals, and she provides for her family. So that multivalence of, is this a positive or necessarily a negative thing, comes out here I think very well. So what we have is a room that has been painted in this kind of lurid shade of, it looks more salmon here, but it's actually more pink. And covering the surfaces are all of these nipples, all of these breast forms. And then everything, by being painted the same color, takes on this kind of strange otherworldly quality. The kitchen then becomes a place of nurturing, but it is also a place that subjects women purely to the nurturing role, to be, the person, because of course, what better example of nurturing is there than the nipple or the breast, because this is how you nurse a child, and the sheer fact of biology is that women take on this role because they have breasts. I'm being Captain Obvious here, but I think I need to spell these things out. That our biology forces us into certain roles, but a woman in a modern society doesn't necessarily want to accept those roles, and yet there's a lot of power in that role. There's a lot of kind of meaning in that role as well. And so I love this because, with the nipples just plastered everywhere, it makes it ubiquitous, everything being colored the same, it kind of teases those out. There's a few other rooms. The thing is a massive installation, but it dealt with tropes and stereotypes of women, images of women as brides and mannequins dressed up, again, pitting ideal women against real women. And then what I also loved is it also worked very hard to incorporate non-traditional materials. And by non-traditional materials, I mean things associated with craft, because this was another thing that divided the feminists. That is, painting, sculpture, these were considered high art and had been in Western tradition for several centuries. But there was a division between high art and low art, that is, art that was regarded as minor art or decorative art. And so anytime you put an adjective in front of art, it changes the intent. And who was producing decorative art, like textiles? Well, it was women. So if you look back well, okay, to be fair, in the Western tradition, it was women. Because if you go to Africa and other places in the world, weaving is done by men. That's kind of an interesting thing. Depends on your culture, which gender is associated with textile arts. So, if you go to Scotland, for example, lace weaving was a male thing, and men did it, and it was a high prestige thing. And Irish fishermen would knit their own sweaters. But if you go to, and same thing with West Africa, amongst the Akan culture, all that beautiful kente cloth was traditionally done only by men for that reason. But in lots of other cultures, like you go to Norway, or you go to the American Southwest, amongst the Navajo, weaving is done exclusively by women. And so there is this kind of perception, at least in the Western world, that textile arts are female and oil painting and sculpture is male. And that's an arbitrary decision. That's an arbitrary thing. Men can weave and women can paint, so it's really kind of ridiculous. And so there was an attempt to bring in crochet, to bring in textile arts, because these were arts associated with women, and to elevate those forms and to elevate those skills, and to say that, hey, you just decided this was arbitrary. You see this a lot in the world, and I teach non-Western art, and it's like, if you have one culture that values book arts, then they don't make big marble statues and oil paintings. They get lowered in esteem in Western views, or at least they used to. They're not so much anymore, but they used to, because book arts are regarded as a minor art or a decorative art in the West. And so the same thing was happening. Arts that were associated with traditional craft, associated with women, were devalued. Arts like oil painting, marble statues were elevated. And that's really arbitrary. And they broke down those distinctions. Why is one regarded as a high art and one is not? So you do see that. My favorite room, however, is the bathroom. And I just have terrible slides of this. I don't have very good images. But the room is fascinating. So again, they love dealing with mannequins. Mannequins are great stand-ins for ideals or phony ideals of women, and they integrate her into the linen cabinet. But my favorite part is that the room was painted entirely white and done in absolute white tones, with the exception of these feminine hygiene products. And these feminine hygiene products were, I don't think they used real blood, were dyed red as if they had used real blood. And I love this because it shows what a bizarre world it is to be a woman in this consumerist society, this post-World War II consumerist society. The simple biological fact since the beginning of time is that women menstruate. They do. It is one of these undeniable facts. It is a perfectly natural act. And yet, in our clean, tidy post-World War II consumer society, that is somehow seen as shameful or as unclean. And it's been seen as shameful and unclean in other societies as well. It's interesting. There are a few societies that menstruation is no big deal. But there are a lot of societies, for example, if you go into Jewish law, for example, a woman has to be declared clean after childbirth and other things. And, a lot of just simple biological facts of a woman's existence are treated as something shameful, as treated as something that should not be seen. And think about this yourself. Think about feminine hygiene products. Think about, yes, I'm here on YouTube talking about feminine hygiene products. Hi, Mom. Anyhow, think about tampons. Think about maxi pads. And think about the color they use. They always like to, they're so absorbent. But think about the colors that they use in those commercials. They always use blue dye. It's like, what are women horseshoe crabs? Are they aliens? Do they not bleed red? And it's funny because we try to deny the reality of it. And by doing that, now whether it's intentional or not, and I do think it's intentional, it creates a sense of shame, that this is something that women are supposed to be ashamed of. So here we have this wall of feminine products and a trash can full of used feminine products and a hanging line hanging up with feminine products. So we have this completely white room, and the only thing that's color is either the red of the blood of menstruation, or you have the bright packaging and advertising of these feminine hygiene products. And it shows how absurd it really is. And I remember when I first saw this, it struck me that, wow, I've never thought about that before. You know, is there something similar in the male world where something that is conceived of as typically male is seen as shameful, and an ordinary bodily function that is part of everybody's life and every society, and you have to hide it in a bathroom, or they don't even acknowledge the real color of it? I can't even think of anything like it. So stuff like this becomes very important. And you can see this as you go throughout the house, that every part, from the dining room, etc., utilized food preparation, again, associated with female activity. So it really kind of broke through this idea of gendered spaces and gendered identity, and made people think of it in a way that they never had before. Now, Sylvia Slay is an artist here that I could just as easily put in the lecture on the return to naturalism. In the 1960s, late 1960s and 1970s, there is a very strong return to naturalism with artists like, well, there's a wide variety of them: Alex Katz, Lucian Freud, etc. You could even put David Hockney in there for a while. And also photorealism as well. So there's this strong return to naturalism, and Sylvia Slay was part of that tradition. But I put her in here because her subject matters, again, deal with this trope of challenging, gendered spaces. And specifically what she does is deal with art history and gendered art in art history. So she was a traditional painter. She painted in oil paints on canvases. And of course, if you go into any museum and around the world and you look at those kind of things, you look at oil paintings, etc., you're going to see a lot of female nudes everywhere you go. They're just everywhere, because the female nude is this kind of representation of ideal form. Now, I've spoken about this before. A lot of this was BS. I mean, even in the 19th century, they realized this was a way of getting soft porn out there without, giving it this pastiche of respectability. And even male artists recognized it was kind of absurd. That's what Manet's Luncheon on the Grass is all about. But at the same time, it's still the idea of a female nude being this just established standard of art history, and the male nude is just not. So she inverts tables. And so she was surrounded by a collection of very famous people and individuals in her entourage and in her company, and she would paint them nude. And so she idealized the male nude. So this painting I love completely, because this one takes on the subject of the Rokeby Venus. So the Rokeby Venus is one of these most famous nudes done by Velázquez, and it has the same form. It has the same reclining figure with the arm. As you can see, I love that we have, let me grab the pen, that you have the arm here that's bent up. He is regarding himself and his own beauty in a mirror, just like Venus here is regarding herself. But I love that she's pulled another trick from Velázquez. Velázquez often would paint himself as if he was in the background of his paintings. Remember Las Meninas, a very famous painting, Las Meninas. So she has painted herself in this mirror. So in this regard, this under Velázquez becomes an image of beauty, but it also becomes an image of vanity, because the goddess sees her beauty in the mirror. And so this becomes inverted and becomes an example of male vanity. And this isn't an accidental choice at all. Remember those suffragettes? Mary Richardson was this radical suffragette who took a razor, a cleaver, I think, actually to the Rokeby Venus and nearly destroyed it. And it had to be painstakingly restored. So the suffragists themselves knew that this objectifying thing was creating this world where it was skewing our idea and representation of women. But I like how Sylvia Slay tackles this. I think this is a far better way of tackling this. Saying, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And, I can show you how your objectification and sexualization of the female form is biased, wrong, and arbitrary by doing the same thing to men. But what I like about it is that her paintings are sincerely beautiful and sincerely respectful of of the male figures, perhaps in a way that the male artists, the female artists, the male artists were not of the female body. Excuse me. So I love this one. This is called The Turkish Bath. And of course, this is a group of people that she knew, and she gathers them together. So this is the 70s, so there's a lot of hair. We're kind of not into body hair anymore. Guess we're... All right, but, she displays this male beauty, this kind of love of male beauty. She even has someone playing a guitar, as if, men hang around like this, which we don't. But she's deliberately playing off these kind of same themes. Like this one is compared to Ong's, Turkish Bath, where you have a person here playing guitar. These highly sexualized and sexist and racist images of women, white European women in Oriental or Islamist contexts. And so again, that's why he's playing a guitar, is because it's absurd, it's kind of an absurd thing. And so she points out the absurdity of these kind of past great paintings, but she also is kind of very respectful to the male figures. They are beautiful. They have a kind of dignity, in that way. And what's interesting is that as she goes on painting, whether she's painting, Paul Rosano was one of her favorite models for this. Paul Rosano would be displayed. There he is in his little Daisy Dukes. But here he is in all of his full glory, that she did a whole series of iterations of this. And so, she said, it has always been difficult for women to do creative work, or indeed to have any profession that dows prestige in our chauvinist patriarchal society. It was particularly hard for ambitious women painters who wished to paint the most highly regarded subjects, history painters. This was because it was impossible for them to do drawings and paintings from nude models, female or male, so that figure compositions would be the most difficult for them. So, and that's actually true, that it's kind of fascinating that for, women were allowed to go to art school in the 19th century, but they were not allowed to paint nudes, either male or female. But if you were a male in the 19th or early 20th century and you went to go do figure drawing, there would be males, there would be females, there would be nude people all over. One of the few people that actually fought against this was Thomas Eakins. Thomas Eakins actually stripped himself down nude so his female students could draw him nude, which is creepy. But, at least he believed in this idea of equality, of equal access to nudes. So Sylvia Slay recognized that there wasn't equal access to nudes. And she says, okay, so we ought to have equal access to nudes. And so she deliberately made a point of finding male models and painting them, and also making them accessible to other female artists, And she says, I had noted from my childhood there were always pictures of beautiful women, but very few pictures of handsome men. So I thought it would be truly fair to paint handsome men for women. And what's interesting to her is that to her and a lot of her later work, she started incorporating both males and females in her work as classical nudes. As, she kind of sees the inherent beauty in the female nude, or the nude itself, and starts off kind of tweaking the idea, saying, hey, let's, why is this a one-way street? But then later in her work, she moved to more just expression of the nude. You can see a kind of evolution in her work that I really quite like, where at first she's deliberately tackling, kind of tropes by going after things like these Orientalist paintings by Ongla in the Turkish Bath, or by, going after things like the Rokeby Venus, creating kind of inversions, kind of parodies. But as her work matures, she just fully embraces nudity and all of it, and say, let's let all of that go aside, and let's, as artists, be free to paint who we wish to paint. So, quite love her stuff. Love her stuff. Love it, love it, love it. But there are also other ways of challenging it. So while Sylvia Slay was going through methods of exploring how the human figure is represented, particularly the female figure, in art history and how was just created for the male gaze, and by creating a kind of counter female gaze to it, while she was doing that and kind of deconstructing things that way, we have others that are deconstructing things in a completely different way. And because the female body is such a major prominent part of Western art, it makes sense that women would then use their bodies to express that. So we have Carolee Schneemann, for example, who would, in her body art, do this subversion of gender roles and domestic environments as a way of reclaiming female identity. This is where, Greer's work, the female eunuch, becomes so important. This idea of reclaiming sexual identity for themselves, so to define it. So she uses her body as the primary medium, as a kind of performance. And so by doing that, she's trying to emphasize women's agency. So she did one of these first performances was up to and including her limits, which was her nude. She had a sling in a room, and she would position her body in her sling and then write these things or just scribble on the walls, producing this kind of performance that then created this. But her most famous work is going to be Interior Scroll. So this was performed in East Hampton, New York, August 1975. And it was an audience of mainly female artists. So it was created for that intent. She goes out into this performance, and the attributes of the performance are a table, a sheet. Again, she wears an apron. An apron, again, is a sign of domesticity, a sign of traditional gender roles in the kitchen, etc. So we have all of these artifacts that represent traditional female identity. But then under this, she's naked, she's smeared with paint, she goes out and performs a variety of poses, all typically unfeminine, and then she called these life model action poses. Again, so she's parodying, in a sense, the figure drawing figures, that you'd have a figure, of a nude female pose, and pose for who? Male artists to draw, to practice. So she's kind of tackling that idea. So again, subverting traditional images of female domestic roles. This ultimately culminates in her removing from her vagina a scroll. That's why this thing is called Interior Scroll. And the Interior Scroll was taken. She then reads the text on the Interior Scroll. The text of the scroll is taken from a film, an experimental film that she had begun in 1973 called Kitsch's Last Meal, a letter to an art critic. And it is full of discussions of the idea of the body and the role of the body and the idea and the gender identity of the individual. And it says, in part, it's a long scroll. You can see the text here. The very vivid thing of her removing this from her body, the emblem of her, femaleness, and then, expositing this, coming out literally from her interior. It says, physicalize the invisible, marginalized, and deeply suppressed history of the vulva, the powerful source of orgasmic pleasure, of birth, of transformation, of menstruation, of maternity, to show that it is not a dead, invisible place. Again, saying that, female body parts are not just there to make babies, not just there for male pleasure, but women have a role to play in this, and this is the main source of their identity. So reclaiming this identity. So really kind of powerful but also difficult imagery to get through. So, and then we get to Linda Benglis, who also started producing images like this. So remember Linda Benglis. Linda Benglis was actually one of these post-minimalist painters, not painters, but sculptors, who was pouring these polyurethane and resin forms over molds to create these organic forms in direct contradiction to the hard edge, glassy and metallic and industrial forms of people like, say, Donald Judd and Carl Andre and others. And she was actually doing really significant, incredible work, and a lot of it was getting absolutely zero recognition. And so she decided that, well, the male heavy art community needed something to shake it up. So she actually wondered, how do I do this? How do I break into this kind of environment that is dominated by, the patriarchy and also dominated by capitalism? And again, it becomes subversive. So she took a photo of herself with this sexual artifact. I guess I've gone past the range. I can say dildo. Just, oh my gosh. That's going to get sampled out and turned into a TikTok. Oh boy. You know what? I'm just going to go hide. My mother doesn't have to know I actually say stuff like this. Anyhow, so she used this sexual toy, and she took this photo with sunglasses covering eyes, as very prominent sexualized things, but also taking the very symbol of masculinity and reappropriating in that way. And she paid $3,000 for the ad, $3,000 to place this as an ad in Art Forum. So again, we're linked to pop art. We're subverting advertisements, and we're subverting objects of the capitalism and consumerist society. And in this case, this is a particular way of saying it's not just a consumerist society; it's a patriarchal consumerist society, and subverting it to bringing it. It was really something else. It was something no one had ever really done before, and it showed how feminism was going to be this very strong activist force. Again, this being, the part of the argument that, well, yes, we can compete on equal footing if we're ever allowed in the door. But if we can't be allowed in the door, we'll find a back door in, and the back door here is through these art forms. So Judy Chicago continued the work that she did from the Women's House, and she started in the 70s and the 80s, creating a whole series of projects, again, dedicated to women's materials and crafts, and also dedicated to ideas of women coming together to create change. The first of these was the dinner party. So here is Judy Chicago in front of the dinner party. The dinner party is a large triangular table, and it imagines a party, a dinner party, or gathering, or soiree, among several prominent female figures, both mythological, historical, or otherwise, and it is all on three sides of the table. So one side of the table will be antiquity, the second side will be from antiquity up through the Middle Ages to the modern era, and then the final table is from basically the modern era of feminism, last 200 years. It is in a triangle because triangle was the emblem of change, and it is on triangular tiles because, again, that's the symbol of change. And then, while each place setting is dedicated to a very prominent woman through history, the tiles themselves are written with the names of many other prominent women through history. Now, you may be asking yourself, why place settings? Why a dinner party? Well, the first part, again, is this idea of elevating minor arts. Ceramics and other things, especially like plates or serviceable materials, are often seen as lower arts or as minor arts, and textiles like place settings, etc., like these beautiful place paintings with embroidery and textiles, are again seen as lower arts, and are also, at least in the West, commonly associated with women. So she wanted to elevate women and women's arts, and so each one of these place settings and each one of these placemats is done by a different team of artists. And she again acted as the coordinator. She kind of chose the names, directed the action of the names, and everyone would come together to collaborate, to be part of this work. And so while we call this Judy Chicago's work, she was very upfront about the fact that it was a collaboration of many dozens of artists putting in their time and effort. And she worked very hard to make sure that the artists felt very much part of this contribution. She gave them kind of free rein. So you can see that each one of these is done in a different style, unique to the artist that created it. But then you ask, why place settings? Why necessarily place settings? This, well, part of this is, again, it's a gathering, a coming together of these women, the meeting of the minds. A dinner party is a natural place for that, but it has more to do with the nature of place settings. And here you're going to get a little American history lesson in a woman that in many ways could be regarded as a proto-feminist because she was a very successful businesswoman, but also as someone who could be seen as a very traditional anti-feminist. It depends on how you think of it. This is Emily Post. And Emily Post is famous in society for having written the book on modern etiquette, called simply Etiquette. And it's been republished dozens of times. It's one of the greatest best-selling books in American history. It's one of the first true self-help books in the world, and one of the most prominent. And a lot of it is dedicated to etiquette and protocol at dinners and at throwing dinner parties and at place settings. And here we need to get into the history of place settings. There's a very strange thing that happened in America, and especially in Europe, in the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, how do I explain this? I will go to Downton Abbey. See, now I'm going to make my mom proud. We're going to go to Downton Abbey. So if you're a fan of Downton Abbey, congratulations, you just got an A for the class. But if you're a fan of Downton Abbey, of course you know that the Count and the Countess are an Englishman and American. So you have the Earl of Grantham. He had title, he had power, but he had no money. So what did he do? He found an American wife from American industrialists whose family had money. And this story actually happened all the time in the 19th and the 20th century. But it only happened in one direction. You never have noblewomen marrying rich, American men with no title, but you do have noble, lords marrying rich American women who have no title. So it's an interesting kind of wrinkle of gendered society. That is, women could not marry, men could not marry below their station, but women could marry up. It's kind of bizarre that it worked that way, but it was true. Women could marry up. And it became a way of people, to level up in society. You could be successful in society, and if you trained your daughters in etiquette, and if they knew how to throw a great dinner party, and they could pass, I guess it's a kind of a controversial word to do, because when we talk about pass, we talk about people of, say, light-skinned blacks passing for white, which happened in the 19th century. But women could pass too, and what they could pass is pass for someone of a higher station. That what mattered more than anything is that women could pull off all the insane protocols of which fork to use and which, how to do a dinner party. And if they could do that, and they could prove that, this would gain access to society, and they could marry up, and they could improve the standing of their children, and this could continue leveling up all the way. And so the middle class, a lot of the middle class in America had real aspirations of improving their social standing, and you couldn't do that unless you could marry up. And so a lot of men were stuck. It's kind of amazing. A lot of men who were very rich and very successful found that they could not reach those upper levels of society because they were nouveau riche, they were too crass, they couldn't get their way into it. Some of them with just money could do it, but a lot of them couldn't do it. But they could marry their daughters into nobility. And in fact, the Duke of Marlborough, the Vanderbilts married one of their daughters off to the Duke of Marlborough. It was a horrendous marriage. She hated the man, but did it because, the family demanded it and the Duke of Marlborough needed the money, which is where the story, in fact, Winston Churchill's mother was American. So this happened a lot. But it happened in large ways, large and small. It wasn't just, industrialists marrying their daughters off to bankrupt, title-rich nobles in Europe. It was also, lower middle class people marrying their daughters into upper class or upper middle class families in America. And so etiquette became a way of moving up. So in this way, many people regard Emily Post as a proto-feminist because she gave women power and she extended power. But many people regard her as an anti-feminist because this locked women into this role of, being servants, of being subservient to the men, of providing, opportunities for men. It's so cool that this happened. But remember WandaVision? First episode of WandaVision? No spoilers. Please, oh my gosh, I can't even go on social media. I mean, nerds, when do you sleep? The thing dropped at like 1 a.m. and I wake up this morning and Instagram is already full of spoilers. What's wrong with you people? It only dropped like 10 hours ago. Anyhow, so women, if you remember that episode of WandaVision, I can tie this into pop culture. That whole first episode is about her making her husband look good for her husband's boss. And I know that sounds anachronistic and crazy, but that's the way it was. Women threw cocktail parties and dinner parties to elevate their husbands, to prove that they were of worth to their husbands. And so having these skills and being able to elevate yourself by a good marriage, by good social prospects, these were essential skills for women. In fact, my mom remembers that you could actually letter in place settings back in the 1950s. Crazy, crazy story. You could actually do this. You could letter in place setting, like you letter in like football or volleyball or any other sport. You could letter in place settings. This was actually a competitive thing for a while there. And then, of course, feminism came along and they said, well, this is just servitude. This is sexist notions about who should serve and who shouldn't serve. And they kind of got rid of it. But I'm amazed to see that it's come back with the foodie culture. Place settings and etiquette and knowing how to do all these things have come back. But what's amazing is that now when you look at these YouTubes, of people who are doing these kind of place settings and hosting dinner parties, they're about split. When you see people doing these charcuterie boards and all this fancy stuff on, the weaponized envy that is in Instagram and Pinterest, it's about evenly split. It's about men and women doing it together. Or doing it, so it's different. So it's interesting that I like and appreciate that the fine dining tradition has come back with the foodie culture, but I'm very happy that it is not something purely relegated now to what women do for men. So that could take us back to this dinner party. How do we get this the dinner party? So Judy Chicago, because she grew up under all of this, was intimately aware of this. So the dinner party becomes, instead of a dinner party by women for men, for the advantage of perhaps their husbands and their children and etc. in future generations, get a promotion, all that rest of that stuff. It's a by women for women. And so it inverts the tables, so to speak, making it as something that is an accomplishment by women, that women do not need men to feel validated or to recognize each other. They can do this for themselves. And so the plates, too, also take on, again, the vulva, the vagina becomes this very clear symbol of power, of reclaiming. And so on the dinner plates are all of these ceramic constructions. The ceramic constructions or paintings or details, again, are mostly abstract forms that look like the abstract forms of George O'Keeffe, but they also are kind of an imitation of the vulva, the source of femininity, but source of creative power and reclaiming of sexuality. So you put this all together, it's really quite remarkable. So on one side, we have the primordial goddess, this kind of Mother Earth goddess, but we also have historical figures like Hatshepsut, the only queen of ancient Egypt and antiquity, who was a pharaoh, who actually ruled as a pharaoh. But we also have characters out of Jewish folklore, such as Judith, but also classical history. Hypatia was the last classical philosopher in Alexandria. It's amazing that at the end, she was actually killed. She was a pagan philosopher in Alexandria, but she was killed by Christians. And so it's amazing that one of the last vestiges of classical philosophy is Hypatia, this woman, so therefore preserved. We also have Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was, a kingmaker and ruler in her own right, and Hildegard de Bingen, who was this mystic, a Christian mystic, and Nunn, who wrote songs and visions and etc. As we get to the modern end, we have, of course, representation of a lot of different cultures. Sojourner Truth, Sacagawea, of course, who was the great leader of the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark group. They would have been absolutely lost without her. But then we move into more, like traditional writers, Virginia Woolf and Emily Dickinson. I think Emily Dickinson's place setting here is just perfect. And all of these, come together. So all of these features together, feminine arts, textile arts, collaborative works, etc., they all come together to make a really powerful statement. So having done this once, Judy Chicago tried to do it again, and this one is quite different. This is quite different. This was called the Birth Project. And the Birth Project had a series of tapestries or hangings that, again, were talking about this issue of birth. In the same regard, she got a bunch of different artists and craftsmen to come together to collaborate. Well, but while everyone had a very positive outcome of the dinner party, which kind of wrapped up in 1979, this one, which I think happened in 1985, was almost a complete disaster from start to finish. Judy Chicago had a very clear vision of what she wanted, and she wanted to emphasize that birth is painful, that birth causes stretch marks, it can cause death, and so she really wanted to validate this kind of enormous pain and trial of birth. And so the designs and the subjects, which were her chosen subjects, emphasize that. I mean, here we have this faceless figure bent over, and we see milk pouring from the breasts, but it is blending with the blood from the afterbirth. So there is life and death there. And so it has a much darker tone. I mean, when we look at this has a very fun tone. This has a very, kind of collaborative tone. And it's very beautiful and very elegant, but also very evocative and very diverse and uses a lot of terms. This stuff ends up being very abstract. It focuses on pain. You see this woman being almost like she's ripped in half. And many of the artists quit. Many of the artists of the product said, we're done. That she was dictatorial and tyrannical on this project and wouldn't allow any kind of, wouldn't brook any kind of disagreement. And many of the women felt like, I understand the pain, I understand that part of it, but the focus exclusively on the pain of it makes it look like it wasn't worth it. And of course, Judy Chicago, I don't think, was a mother at the time. And so they felt like, here were these women who were mothers saying, there's also joy and everything else. So we see a kind of conflict here. It's kind of interesting that, in one part she embraced collaboration because she saw that as a feminist ideal. But by this point, I think she was a successful enough artist that she felt like she had to control the final project. And so that it inevitably led to friction. And I think that's a good setup for our next artist, in that you can see that in the 1970s, feminism is already tearing itself apart. Second wave feminism is really not certain of what it wants to be or where it wants to go. Is it pro-body or is it anti-body? There were some feminists that were like absolutely against beauty pageants, against beauty, although there was one instance where bras were burned. Bra burning was largely a myth. It didn't happen terribly often. It was largely a myth. But there were that were against standards of beauty, against makeup, against waxing and shaving and all the rest of this as imposed by the patriarchy on them. There were some that even were radically against sex with males of any variety, saying that all forms of sex with a man are kind of analogous to rape, and that the only way to be a true feminist is to be a lesbian, to embrace a purely feminine understanding of love and intimacy. So, but there were other women that were looking at this saying, wait a minute, you are beginning to dictate rules on how I am a woman. You are beginning to dictate how I see my own body and how I use my own body. And that feels a lot like the patriarchy. That feels a lot like what the patriarchy was telling me to do. I mean, your rules are different, but they're no less limiting. And so you start to see fracturing. And of course, this is all leading up to what would become third wave feminism. Third wave feminism merges in the 80s and the 90s, and it tries to say, hey, first of all, second wave feminism was largely concerned with the issues of upper middle class white elite women, which was true. A lot of these women came out of the middle class and elite institutions. They were predominantly white, and so they said, what about, women of color? We have a different, viewpoint on this. And also there were some who began to challenge this problem with sex, that, well, hey, if I'm a woman and I like my body, if I want to wear lipstick, that's my choice. If I want to use my sexuality, that's my choice. And if I want to have sex with men or women, that's my choice. And so you have a kind of pro-sex kind of movement emerging out of third wave feminism. It's really kind of debatable about whether we're in fourth wave feminism or not. We'll talk more about third wave feminism when we get to postmodernism and postmodern feminism. But even in the 1970s, we have people that were challenging this. One of my favorites in this way is Hannah Wilke. Hannah Wilke was, again, one of these persons who used body art and photography and performance art. And what's interesting is she shows this intersection between body image, body identity, and fashion photography and identity. She did this whole series of things called the SOS Starification Object Series. And in this, she would take like gum, and the gum would be formed like scars, or sometimes into the shape of vulvas or etc. And these would be stuck onto her body. So these are the scars. So starification is a portmanteau. It's a blending of two different words: star for celebrity, like star, but also scarification. And so it reacts to pop art in this way, that it takes these things and it shows them as being gendered, but also objectifying and problematic. Now, what's interesting is this caused a huge controversy because she took her own body and displayed her own body. She put these scars over herself made out of gum, but then she took these very provocative pictures, which were analogous to pornography or fashion stuff that was more traditional feminine. So there's kind of an incongruity to this, that you have something that seems very sexualized. Carolee Schneemann's stuff, for example, and Linda Benglis' stuff doesn't seem, it's overt and it has nudity, but it doesn't seem overtly sexualized. It's kind of desexualized, kind of points out how women's bodies are objectified. But this used that sexuality in a way and, pointed out the kind of contradictions of this objectification. And this caused her a lot of criticism. She also did another series called Through the Large Glass, and this was performed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And she did a very sexual striptease behind Duchamp's very famous The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, even The Large Glass, which was this strange kind of collage sandwiched between two pieces of glass that originally wasn't cracked, but it got cracked in transport, and Duchamp said, you know what, I like it better that way, leave it. Because that's very Duchamp. So here was a Duchamp, an artist that was noted for pushing the absurd, a Dadaist, pushing the absurd. And so she does a striptease from behind the large glass, which would seem to connect to this idea of the absurd. The absurd, of course, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, and what she's doing, she's stripping. So there's this pun on words, these visual puns, playing on terms, using her own sexuality. Well, this got her into a lot of hot water because, again, they were saying, well, you're not just making fun of the objectification of the human body, you're objectifying your own body. And so a lot of feminists actually got very, very mad at her for what they thought was kind of her selling out, or, selling out the principles of second wave feminism. And she actually responded to this, that she did this wonderful sign, Marxism in Art, Beware of Fascist Feminism. That she was basically saying that, you have no right to tell me how to use my body. And again, this is one of the problems with, I think, critical theory and Marxist theory, is that by segregating people into categories of oppressed and oppressor, it's too simplistic. It's too simplistic. You have the oppressors, or the patriarchy over here, and the oppressed, which is the proletariat or the women over here, and there's a breach between those two. But the truth is, we oppress ourselves. Just go on Instagram, go on social media. No one's forcing us to use these things. No one's forcing us to engage in all of these acts of weaponized envy, showing off what perfect families and what perfect charcuterie boards we can put together. Nobody's forcing that on us. We're doing that ourselves. So there's a lot of gray area in there that needs to be explored, and she was exploring that, but they didn't like that. And so you can see the fault lines breaking in second wave feminism. She continued to do this throughout her life, using her body in a sexual way and creating these poses, but of course she ended up passing away because of cancer. And so she continued to use her body, and in the later part of her life documented these changes, placing herself, showing herself in robes, sometimes placing herself in robes and in pictures that made her look like the Virgin Mary. There's one other person I want to talk about that's right on this cusp of this time period, who is obviously a precursor to many of the things that will happen in third wave feminism and postmodern feminist art. And we're going to finish up with her. And she's an artist that I was shocked that I was in my 40s before I even heard of her. I had been taking classes my whole life, and then I just stumbled across her, and I was like, what? And how did I not know about this artist? Ana Mendieta. Ana Mendieta was a Cuban-American exile, left Cuba in 1961, I think, and came to America. And a lot of her work, again, explored issues of gender and identity. And really, her stuff was just prescient. She was really looking forward to ideas of transgender identity and etc. And she was also looking at ideas of ethnic cultural identity in light of feminism. But she's also one of the first to actually push ideas of ecofeminism, blending what we might call as land art and environmental art with feminism, which is a huge thing and has been since about the late 90s. But she was doing stuff like this way back in the 70s and 80s. So she would do series of photos where she would alter her body, taking tape and taping parts of her, cheek or her nose up to alter her face, taking face paint and painting herself to lighten her skin or to darken her skin, using different wigs or hair colors to create that, and taking photos of herself. Again, being a person who is of Cuban extraction in America, she would have come up against not just racism. And so she was doing intersectionality before intersectionality as a term even existed, recognizing that these are not just issues of male and female, but they are issues of male and female within culture, within race, and within society. And she would often do these series of portraits where she would take hair clippings and paste them on, okay? If you know anything about Latino culture, Latino males, very proud of their facial hair. Facial hair becomes a kind of source of identity, of masculinity. So she would take these photos of herself, again, looking otherwise conventionally female, but drawing in, this kind of idea of masculine identity, and taking it and playing with that, crossing these boundaries in a way that was really kind of revolutionary for her time. She was very underappreciated at her time. I think by far the most important series she did is her Silhouette series. Her Silhouette series, she took photographs of herself in nature, or sometimes photographs of nature using her impression. Now again, this is probably one of the beginnings of ecofeminism, and ecofeminism is a kind of interesting topic. We may touch on it later. But ecofeminism, this wasn't ecofeminism, this is pre-ecofeminism, but all the ecofeminists, I think, have to acknowledge her role in kind of bringing this to light. And I think what's interesting here is that there is a kind of connection between women and nature in a way that doesn't exist between men and nature. In the sense that if you go around, and this is true of many cultures, again, most cultures are patriarchal. Women have control of the domestic arrangements, which means they have control of food, water. Most places, it is women who are responsible for getting water, is responsible for building the tent or the hut, or etc., especially in non-Western cultures that are developing. And so what you see is that men go off to work, but women are very much engaged with the environment. And then you pull this into ideas of the mother goddess myth, which probably is more myth than reality, but it was a very, very popular idea at the time, that way in our remote ancient past, humanity worshipped a mother goddess. Now, whether that's true or not, that's been debated. This was a very, very popular, I can't remember her name, the scholar who came up with this, but it was a very popular theory at the time, that there was a kind of primordial mother goddess that was the universal goddess of all mankind, and that later society was taken over by patriarchal societies. In its earliest phases, you see these Venus figurines, etc. This is evidence that society was matriarchal and not patriarchal, and that later warlike patriarchal societies took over. Well, truth is there's not much evidence to support that, and it's probably not true. Plus, it's also kind of misinterprets things. I always tell people, I said, matriarchal. There have been a few matriarchal societies in the world, and they have been just as warlike as the patriarchal societies. We should always make sure that we're not imposing a false understanding of things. It may be that our earliest ancestors worshipped a mother goddess, but they could have worshipped a mother goddess and been totally warlike. When you think about Athena is a goddess of war, and she was the patron deity of the Greeks in Athens, and you can't find a more misogynistic society than ancient Greece, and yet their chief principal deity was a woman. The same thing is true in the Middle Ages. I tell this to people that, we tend to say, when we see images of the Virgin Mary, well, this must have been focused for women, and that's often not the case. What's funny is that the female saint that is most often invoked in times of war and battle is the Virgin Mary. She is the patron saint and protector of people like Charlemagne and Louis IX and all these important kings of the Middle Ages. So we look at the Virgin Mary and we think, mother, nurturing, etc. And in the Middle Ages, they would have looked at the Virgin Mary and said, butt kicker, total, destroyer of nations, because they did. They see her as a military saint. It's kind of crazy. You don't really expect that. So even if there was a mother goddess in the past, maybe she was this warlike goddess, we don't know. And maybe she was mostly honored and revered by men. You can never make assumptions like this. But at the time that Anna Mendieta was doing this, there was this pervasive view of there was once this mother goddess. So her forms take these forms that look like these Venus figurines with upstretched hands, covering herself in earth, photographing herself, or lying down in the earth and then creating a depression for herself and then lining it with natural things, using pigments and natural colors or branches or photographs and taking photographs and forms of the silhouette. This one is one of my favorites. So we have this form that's clearly based on one of these early Venus figurines, and she would lie down to create this form on the coast and then fill it with pigments. Again, red, symbol of life, blood, etc., menstruation. And then, of course, this would erode as the water would come over it. And so this became a very powerful series about a kind of nativist, primitivist idea of the female spirit and the power of the female spirit. And they became they're very, very beautiful images. And they're very well appreciated today, but they were not terribly well appreciated in her time. And this is kind of a downer place to end this lecture, but she died young in 1985 under tragic and suspicious circumstances. She was actually married to Carl Andre. So remember Carl Andre, the guy with the bricks? That him. The one that Linda Benglis was kind of challenging. They were married, and she... I don't want to say fell. She fell out of a 34-story window in Greenwich Village. And Carl Andre called 911 and claimed that they were having an argument about why his career was so much bigger than hers, and that at that moment she ran out and threw herself out the window. And many people to this day think that Carl Andre murdered her, that he threw her out of the window, that he got in a rage and threw her out, and that she was murdered. And Carl Andre was acquitted, so he was tried for the murder, but he was acquitted. So not a very glorious end to what I think a person is an underrated career. I'm just still working out there's still some great artists out there. I always want to try to expand my offerings whenever I give this lecture. But we'll end it there. Thank you so much. When we come back next time, we'll talk about some of the trends that move on from photorealism and the return of naturalism to going into neo-expressionism. Look forward to it. See you then. Bye-bye, and don't tell my mother about this video, please. I swear. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.